We play the role of the policy. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our program today. My name is Carolyn Knowles, and I'm the Interim Director of Development and Alumni Relations at the University of San Francisco School of Law. This is a webinar on COVID-19 and the implications to the real estate industry with Professor Tim Iglesias and Jonathan Madison. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. All of the attendees, you are muted today, but we really encourage you to participate through using our chat feature. Please post your questions there, and after Professor Iglesias and Jonathan have had their discussion, we will open it up to questions between the two of them. Also, if you're having any technical issues, please email lawevents@usfca.edu, and we will be happy to help you as much as we can. With that, I would like to introduce our two speakers. Professor Iglesias is an expert in housing and property law and has served on the USF law faculty since 2001. He co-edited the Legal Guide to Affordable Housing Development Law. He is a frequent speaker and media commentator on housing issues. In 2015, Governor Brown appointed him to the California Fair Employment and Housing Council, which drafts regulations to implement California's laws that protect the people of California from unlawful discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations, and from hate violence. Professor Iglesias was reappointed by Governor Newsom in 2019. Prior to his legal career, Iglesias was a member of the Society of Jesus Jesuit Order from 1975 to 1989. On a personal note, Professor Iglesias was the first faculty member that I met at USF School of Law. He and I rode the bus together on my first day as an employee. Jonathan Madison graduated from the USF School of Law in 2016. He is currently an associate for Fried Williams LLP, where he clerked as a student. He also clerked for Wells Fargo's legal group, working on issues pertaining to estate planning, residential and commercial real estate transactions, and financial services. Prior to his legal career, Jonathan worked as a professional policy staff for the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Financial Services. In that role, Jonathan managed policy portfolios on housing and oversight issues for the committee chairman and conducted strategy to facilitate the passage of housing reform legislation. Jonathan also worked as a congressional intern for several offices in the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. Today, Jonathan regularly contributes opinion columns in newspapers circulated throughout the Bay Area, including the San Francisco Chronicle and the San Mateo Daily Journal. Welcome to both of you. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for that wonderful introduction. And it's great to be doing this with you and also with Jonathan. As Caroline said, the topic of this webinar is the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on the real estate industry. And here's how it goes. I'm going to give an introduction, mostly providing context for about 6 or 7 minutes. And then Jonathan and I will have a conversation about some key issues, and then we'll answer questions from the webinar participants. So the coronavirus has disrupted all in real estate sectors: the office, retail, hospitality, and residential. Real estate owners and sellers, lenders, developers, real estate agents, title companies, landlords, tenants, and management are all having to deal with these disruptions. Government responses to COVID-19, including stay-at-home orders, shut down much of the economy. This deprived a lot of businesses of their customers, which put pressure on commercial lessors who did not have sufficient revenue to pay their rents, thus putting commercial lessees in a bind. But housing never closed. And in fact, stay-at-home orders required housing to stay open for those who had homes. In theory, this would be good for residential landlords because their businesses were not closed. However, a large percentage of workers were not able to earn their salaries. Nationally, people earning less than $40,000 per year had a 50% chance of losing their job due to the pandemic. And therefore, many tenants were not able to pay their rent. So this put residential landlords and their tenants in a bind. People still want to buy and sell houses, but the real estate market has had to largely move online. For example, relying on virtual showings and electronic signatures to make deals happen. People are still establishing new rentals, and moving is considered essential if the move is already planned or if the move is necessitated by safety or habitability reasons, or if the move is necessary to preserve access to shelter. These dramatic housing events in the housing market are not taking place in a vacuum. First, we've been struggling with the housing affordability crisis that affects both middle and low-income households for a long time. 55 of California's 58 counties have lacked sufficient affordable housing homes even before the pandemic. Second, the huge inequality of wealth and income means that this crisis affects households very differently depending upon their economic means. For example, those whose jobs can continue still have a regular income, and even if their incomes are reduced, those who have substantial savings can draw on them to pay their essential expenses, such as rent or mortgages. Third, our racially and economically segregated housing patterns make households comprised of low income and people of color bear the brunt of this disruption. According to census data, about 74% of white households live in homes they own, but only about 44% of Black and households and 49% of Latinx households do. Nationally, Black and Latinx people are twice as likely to rent as white people, so they will be most at risk of evictions. And finally, Black and Latinx households also pay a higher share of their income on rent in most major metropolitan areas. Some housing advocates have been pushing local governments to provide more housing for homeless people, now framed as a public health priority, in addition to all the other policy reasons for doing so. Before I begin my conversation with Jonathan, I just want to give a brief overview of governmental responses affecting the real estate market. Of course, it's a lot to try to follow, and it's changing all the time, but I'll do my best to try to give a description of the current situation. First, what's the federal government done? Congress passed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, otherwise known as the CARES Act, which provides mortgage, foreclosure, and eviction relief for certain residential and multifamily borrowers with federally backed mortgages. And it also established a moratorium on foreclosures for single-family homeowners with mortgages backed by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or Federal Housing Administration. At least Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have extended this moratorium at least until August 31st. And these homeowners who have lost income or employment due to the coronavirus may be eligible for payment deductions or deferrals on mortgages for as long as a year. What about residential leases? Currently, there's a federal moratorium on evictions in public housing and government subsidized housing, but this moratorium is set to end on July 24th. What has the state of California done? Governor Newsom issued an executive order authorizing local governments to halt evictions for renters impacted by the pandemic through July 28th. But in early April, the Judicial Council of California went much further. It placed nearly all evictions in the state on hold until 90 days after California's COVID-19 state of emergency ends. Governor Newsom also announced a 90-day mortgage payment relief package for homeowners and consumers. Participating financial institutions will offer mortgage payment forbearances of up to 90 days to borrowers economically impacted by the crisis. The California legislature is also getting into the mix, considering a wide variety of responses. Here's two examples. AB 828 by Assemblyman Phil Ting of San Francisco would allow courts to force landlords to reduce rents by 25%. And SB 1410 by Senators Caballero and Bradford would establish the COVID-19 Emergency Rental Assistance Program, through which the state would make direct rental payments to help tenants who cannot afford to pay their rent due to the virus. In addition, based on their own authority and authorization from Governor Newsom's executive orders, many local governments in California have been active in addressing the problems faced by both commercial and residential tenants. These vary substantially by jurisdiction. Meanwhile, housing advocates are organizing rent strikes and demanding rent forgiveness. So overall, it's quite a dramatic and difficult time for anyone in the real estate business. Okay, Jonathan, so let's get into it. So first of all, how has the coronavirus affected real estate transactions in your experience?
In a very significant way. When you talk about commercial real estate transactions in general, it's kind of halted the market a little bit, just because now you have a situation where lessors are thinking, do we actually, or actually the businesses that are operating in those buildings are actually thinking, do we actually need to utilize these businesses through buildings? Because you have a situation where everybody's kind of been working from home because we've been forced to with the shelter in place. So now you have people who were previously engaged in the commercial real estate market now questioning to what extent there's going to be a market in some months down the road without a vaccination. How long are we actually going to be working from home more often than not? So you could actually end up with a situation where down the road, there are far fewer businesses that are renting out these big, large commercial spaces like the Salesforce Tower in San Francisco, like all these other buildings, the WeWork building and such. So I think that has caused some anxiety, Professor, for people in the commercial real estate market.
So I'm just curious, do you think that the possible glut of office space buildings could eventually maybe help relieve the housing crisis a little bit, if some of those could be changed to be habitable dwellings?
Absolutely. And in fact, that's happening right now. I was just reading that there are a number of spaces, commercial spaces in the Bay Area that are being converted to residential units. And as you know, we are in a very big housing shortage. It's no secret. We've been in a housing shortage for years now. And that started culminating. People probably started reading about it late last year before this pandemic. So to the extent that we can transfer or make some of those commercial spaces, habitable units for residential tenancies, I think that would be a great thing for the market on both ends.
And how about with regard to sort of real estate transactions, people in buying and selling property? What's your experience on that lately?
Yeah, so there's a lot of what's called force majeure, which is a lot of people trying to opt out of contracts, particularly when the pandemic first hit hard, like in March, and the shelter in places started happening. You had an influx of purchasers, sellers, people trying to get out of these contracts that they had made, particularly lessees, because they understood, look, we're not even using the space anymore. We're going to be working from home for God knows how long. So we've actually seen in our business some uptick in that. Whereas, there's a lot of people, particularly employers and people who operate businesses within these commercial spaces, saying, how do we opt out? Even if there's not an appropriate provision in the contract to opt out, how can we do it? Because we're just losing money at this point. So I think that's going to be something to continue over the next year or so. We saw this happen in 2008, different crisis, of course, the economic crisis we saw, but you also saw an influx then of people trying to opt out of contracts dealing with that sort of recession. So different issue, but we're seeing some of the same things.
So, and related to that, I'd heard that some people are trying to use business insurance policies that include a provision for business interruption to sort of recoup possible losses. How do you think that's going to go?
The insurance companies are going to have the final say. The insurance companies often will give you every reason to say this doesn't apply. So I'd be very interested to see what happens there, Professor. But that is coming up. I've definitely heard about that coming up. And I guess only time will tell over the next year or so how good that's really going to apply with the insurance companies.
Yeah. So let's turn to residential leasing. What's been your experience so far in your practice and what you're seeing in terms of those issues?
So the pandemic has affected landlords and tenants. There's no doubt about it. We obviously hear about how it affects tenants, particularly tenants who lost their jobs. I read some statistic that a tenant who makes less than $50,000 or $60,000 a year is 50% likely to have lost their job due to the pandemic. So the crisis has been very hard for tenants, but to another extent, it's been hard on landlords because if you're a small landlord out there with one property, two properties, not the giants, right? But if you're a small landlord, perhaps you use your property, your tenancy occupied property as an investment property, as a retirement property. If you're not receiving the rents, it's very hard for you to pay the mortgage. So you end up with this domino effect, if you will, of the tenant can't pay the rent because they got laid off, or they have unemployment that just can't cover the rent. And the domino effect on the landlord is that they may not be able to afford to pay the mortgage. And Professor, you did mention the federal assistance for some forbearance options, deferment options for mortgages, and that's a very, very good thing. The one thing I would say about that is the major banks have participated in that, right? Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Chase, but a lot of other banks, less well-known banks, have participated. So there are still some landlords out there, I can tell you, who are hurting, who haven't had access to that assistance. So, it's affected both landlords and tenants far and wide.
And so what are you counseling your own clients about how to handle these issues?
Great question. Communication is key. Communication. And it's funny because, before the pandemic, we saw these issues, really big issues between landlords and tenants. You saw the issue that arose in Oakland with the habitability issues and people who were, some were squatting on properties and things like that. So you had all these tensions arising, and now the pandemic has sort of forced landlords and tenants to kind of communicate, to work together. The landlord understands, particularly the smaller landlord, right, understands that if they don't get the rent, they can't pay the mortgage sometimes. And I think the tenants also understand, if they can't communicate with their landlords, they may end up in a situation where they're in court down the road. So I think this has really forced both tenants and landlords to communicate more. And to that extent, it's a good thing. So we've been advising our clients, I can tell you, to number one, communicate with the tenant. If the tenant says they cannot pay rent, work out a deal with them. You can work out some agreement. Could be a forbearance agreement. We've seen those. You could, and if the tenant's not communicating and not paying rent, send them a letter offering some assistance. You just never know what some dialogue, some kind of communication can do in your relationship, particularly when it comes to money that's, supporting your household or a household, so to speak. So that's what we're advising our clients to do.
Yeah, that's helpful. So, so I'm curious, just to sort of clarify for folks. So, what kinds of evictions at this point can go forward if if a landlord is pressed and the tenant hasn't paid rent, for example?
Well, I can give you one big example in Alameda County where I practice. You pretty much there's a moratorium on evictions. You pretty much can't do any kind of eviction. There's no just cause out there right now, so to speak, right, because of the moratorium, unless, at least in the county of Alameda, if the tenant is a public nuisance, and they actually say, the language says a public nuisance and a public health threat, so to speak. I mean, it has to be a very bad situation. And only in that case, Professor, can you go into court with an emergency order, go in ex parte, which means, of course, you go before the court, before the judge, give prior notice. But you go before the judge and you say, this is an emergency situation, there's no other way out of this. And only in that circumstance right now can you actually proceed to evict a tenant rather quickly. Outside of that, there is a big stall on just about every kind of eviction, non-payment of rent evictions particularly. Very important to note, Dean Preston's recent legislation in San Francisco basically says tenants don't have to pay rent, basically any rent that was owed during the COVID-19 pandemic that they couldn't afford to pay. So they won't have to pay that even after the pandemic is over. So that's a pretty big deal for San Francisco. That's I think the biggest update for landlords and tenants out there. But there's very, very, very limited circumstances where you can actually pursue an eviction now. In very limited circumstances, we are also seeing cases where a tenant owed rent prior to the pandemic. And so a landlord, to some extent, can still collect that. But still, it's important to note that the sheriff is not going to enforce any writs. So they're not going to actually evict the tenant. So one of the things we're actually advising our clients is, look, even if you served a notice today, the sheriff's not going to act on it, So you want to make sure things make logical sense. Another reason to communicate with your tenant.
Right, good. Could you talk a little bit more about the difference in situation between sort of larger companies with multiple properties and sort of the so-called mom and pop landlord and their different situations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the smaller mom and pop, landlord, as I said, I think their biggest issue is paying the rent, being able to afford, to keep the property running and the maintenance and that, so to speak. So to that extent, it's actually easier for them to engage and communicate with their tenants because, maybe they have one tenant or two tenants, maybe they have two properties, one property, and those relationships are much closer, we find. It's easier to communicate with one or two, even a handful of tenants versus 400 tenants, So the dynamic is different and the rapport is different. We're actually seeing that those types of landlords have a better time communicating and managing how they're going to proceed forward. We're noticing on the larger scale, the biggest companies we represent, biggest landlords, they're having a more difficult time, I'd say, just because structurally it's mapping out a strategy to communicate with every tenant for the most part the same. It takes some administration, takes some time, so the dynamic, the relationship is just not there because you might have a tenant that hasn't communicated with their landlord in months, maybe years, just because the dynamic is so different. If we represent a client who has thousands of units out there, it's going to be very difficult for them to communicate often. So the pandemic has forced the bigger sort of giant landlords, so to speak, to actually communicate more with their tenants because there's still the threat, as you know, or the possibility that there could be a domino effect. If one tenant, hundreds of tenants can't pay their rent, it's going to affect even the giant landlords out there. So, communication is far more important for, I'd say, the giant companies out there, the landlords, because the dynamic is different. So while they may not be financially hurting immediately as the smaller landlord would, they have a bigger burden to prevent that from happening. That makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So could you talk a little bit about how the virus has specifically affected residential property management?
Yeah, so property managers are often responsible for some of the maintenance issues and things of that nature. So now this has prompted a lot of questions we're getting from property management companies. Should we clean? Should we do all sorts of maintenance? Is there ever too much? Is there ever enough? And we're advising property management companies to make sure, of course, communicate with the owner of the property, but to make sure that the common areas are clean. And it's never been more important now. Sanitizers readily available, the sanitizing machines, just basically a clean space to prevent the spread of this virus. As we know, this virus can spread so quickly. Very important. That's the question we're getting from a lot of our property managers.
How about the issue of, like, if a property manager finds out somebody has tested positive for the virus, or there's fear among the tenants that somebody has, what are you telling your clients in terms of what do they have duties to inform other tenants, or what are you telling your clients about that?
First thing we tell our clients is, number one, do not disclose the name of the tenant. Very important. But we do advise them to notify every tenant immediately for two reasons. One, it's the right thing to do. Two, there's a liability issue potentially. Failure to warn that a tenant has contracted a virus like this. I mean, it could result in a whole range of liability issues down the road for why the landlord didn't notify other tenants. But very important to keep the identity of the tenant who is affected confidential. Wouldn't even mention the unit number, but to make sure the notice goes out promptly as soon as they get word that the tenant has contracted the virus.
Thank you. So many tenants advocates are predicting a wave of evictions when the courts do reopen. And Diane Yentl, president of the and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, recently stated, quote, "Unless Congress intervenes soon, the coming tsunami of evictions and homelessness will disproportionately harm Black and brown people." So what's your perspective on this?
It's a good question. A few weeks ago, I would have told you that I didn't anticipate a wave necessarily, but not a wave of evictions, but a wave of settlements. Now, that being said, I recently did some research on what happened in Texas because they've already kind of gone through the process of restarting their evictions and stopping their eviction moratoriums. And there were reports, maybe even you've read about, landlords standing in line for 10 hours, 12 hours, just to submit their unlawful detainer paperwork. So, if we take Texas as an example, perhaps, even though we have very different laws here in California that are much more tenant friendly, that could in theory happen because what happens is if the eviction moratorium is over in July or September, whatever it may be, the issue is not going to be the rent that was due during the pandemic. For the most part, a lot of that's been waived. And depending on where you are, particularly in San Francisco, if you're a tenant, you won't have to worry about that. But the rent that's due in August, September, that's going to come due. And for the tenants who are still displaced from work, for the tenants who are still struggling financially, working paycheck to paycheck, that's where it's really going to affect them. And so I think the wave of evictions you may see will have to do with that more than anything else. But still hopeful we'll see more of a wave of settlements, for the most part. I mean, because courts have been very lenient with regard to tenants during this pandemic. Every moratorium we've seen just about has been extended, in different counties, 1 month, 2 months, however it may be. So I think the wave will be less of a wave and probably waves, so to speak, maybe a small wave here, a small wave there. But I think, you can only do so much to delay the inevitable, as I like to say.
Yeah. So it seems to me also there could be a lot of fair housing issues raised by the pandemic. Could you comment on those?
Yeah, there's been some recent developments in fair housing. For one, you can't do criminal background checks. That was a big one. And so to the extent that tenants can't be discriminated against in all different kinds of ways, that will play a big role in going forward, and particularly with the wave and whatnot that we were just talking about, that can mitigate that to some extent because there's all these new protections out there. So that can help tenants for sure.
And I would imagine there's also going to be a lot of complicated disability issues in terms
Absolutely.
of. So do you have any thoughts on those?
Particularly the disability issues resulting from COVID-19. As I've read, this disease can affect your internal organs. It can do more than just affect your respiratory system. So you can have tenants out there who have, are on an oxygen machine or on some kind of other disability resulting from the virus. Perhaps it doesn't even need to be related to the virus in the first place, but now if you're a tenant out there who even suspects you may have contracted the virus, it'll probably be very difficult for you to have your rights depleted in any way or affected in any way. The protections out there will be far and wide. So,
okay. So just two more questions, at least that I have, and then we'll move to the participants. Are there any other important issues that you think people are not, it's not really yet on the radar that people ought to be thinking about?
I mean, going back to your question on the waves, I guess, and this is more of, I guess, a policy thought process for me. And there's no right or wrong answer for this. I just think that because the pandemic happened, I won't say it happened so surprisingly. There's a great debate about that. But because it sort of caught local governments off guard, I think the response to it was so fast that rather than looking for legislation that sort of helped out tenants and landlords throughout this year, it was kind of a gut check. We need to do this, a knee-jerk reaction, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And the one thing, I don't want to see is, we end up down the road, through the end of the year, and we start seeing these waves of evictions that didn't necessarily need to happen. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying I'm an expert on legislation or I would have done anything differently here. Mm-hmm. It's easy to say, but I do think that because it caused a lot of knee-jerk reactions, some of the legislation out there kind of kicked this issue down the road with payment of rent, just justifiably. But I think perhaps we could have done something to prevent the wave, and so that's always going to be lingering in the back of my head. And I'm sure we're going to talk for years after this pandemic is over about what could have been done better.
Right.
But
right.
But that's something to think about.
Okay. So my last question is, so do you see any likely changes in the real estate or residential leasing industry that will come about because of the pandemic, but will then keep going and perdure after the pandemic is over?
Yes, I think the biggest one, from what I'm hearing, is, and I'm hearing about this from my friends in Washington, D.C. I also read about some proposals, but there is talk of a nationwide rent control. Mm-hmm. And they've been talking about this in theory for years, but it was just theory, just philosophy. And, you had some of these advocates like the California Association of Realtors and the California Apartment Association and, real estate advocates who are advocating for a change like this because California has so many different layers and layers and layers and layers of laws that are sometimes hard to follow, and they're so different vastly throughout the state. So to have a nationwide rent control controlled by the federal government that might make it easier to manage the escalation of this pandemic, future pandemics. So now it has actually prompted the discussion from what I'm hearing in Congress, in the White House. You may not have heard about it a whole lot yet, but I can tell you, you're going to hear more about it because it's prompted a discussion of what to do about tenants nationwide who are displaced, whether it's by unemployment, whether it's by the pandemic, those who are disadvantaged, those who have had their rights deprived of them. So you're probably going to hear more about this, the big possibility of a nationwide rent control so that the government can keep track and there's just like a blanket control as opposed to different state rent controls. Some are better than others. California, it will be very interesting to see what happens with California because we're just so different in every way. Right. Recent passage of AB 1482, we probably don't have too much time to go into that. But and all the moratoriums and the local municipal ordinances, there's just so many different layers of just cause, many different layers of rent control. it will be very, very interesting to see how that nationwide rent control, if it were applied, would be applied to California. So I would look out for that, because we're in a pandemic and they're scrambling in Washington to figure out how to address it.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. So now I'm going to turn to some of the questions that people have posted. So people who are watching and listening, you're welcome to post questions in the question and answer Q&A function. So here's the first couple. So one is a person who owns a small triplex property in Oakland, and they've done lots of renovations and repairs. And you know, if they sell now, they're going to lose money. But they're wondering if it, at this point, should they, go ahead and sell? I don't know. What are you thinking about in terms of whether this is a good time for people to sell properties?
Well, the market is coming back much stronger than people have thought about. And it's not just the real estate market, the economy in general. I think people are saying that we didn't anticipate this. So I'd actually say there's more hope in the real estate market coming back. Hopefully we don't see another wave of this. So I preface everything I'm about to say with that. There's always the possibility of that going wrong.
Right.
But I'd say, whether it's now or a couple of months down the road, depending on where the property is, as always, I would say it actually is probably a good time because people are out again, businesses are reopening. There's always a debate about whether it's too early or too soon, but the fact is businesses are opening. The economy is slowly starting to make its way back. People are getting hired again. I looked on the recent unemployment numbers, they're going down. So I think if you find the right deal, you find the right situation, I think you should go ahead and do it. But if it were me personally, and we're working with some clients who are wanting to sell their properties in the coming months, and some who are also purchasing properties. So it's not like it's a bad time. Mm-hmm. I will say that it's actually better than a lot of people think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So here's one. Sort of predictions, like you're saying, are always very shaky and complicated. In talking about the San Francisco real estate market, do you think, first of all, I'm wondering if the recent ordinance is going to draw a regulatory takings claim, whether or not that's going to be, successful or not, about basically making landlords forgive past rent due. But so do you have a sense of whether you think the market, particularly San Francisco and the other kind of hot markets in the Bay Area, are they going to recover? How are they going to recover?
Well, it's an interesting situation when you're talking about buying a property, perhaps inhabited by tenants. You're really rolling the dice there as a landlord. And I think you're feeling kind of shaky. So it all depends on the purpose of the property. If it's an investment property, if it's going to be your property, your dwelling, that's one thing. But if you're buying a property for tenants, you're looking to get into the rental market. We are seeing very few clients these days who are looking to get into the market for those reasons. And particularly if the property is occupied by tenants. People are very shaky because of the moratoriums in place, because of the rent breaks in place. Even before the pandemic, there were people who were shaky about getting into the market just because of all the laws, for better or for worse. But the situation now has definitely escalated. And if you're a landlord out there, or you're a potential landlord who's thinking about getting into the market, I could say their blood pressure is probably up at this point, because you're rolling the dice to some extent, not just because of tenants. You're rolling the dice because you have no idea what's going to happen with the pandemic, first and foremost. If we see another wave, what does that mean for future rent payments? Will you get a break on the mortgage? Will that apply to you? Will you have relief? Are you going to be a big landlord who can absorb some of the financial loss, or are you going to be a small landlord who's looking at this as a retirement property?
Right.
And how bad is that going to hurt you? And the whole domino effect of issues. So, I guess to answer your question, depends on what the purpose of the property is going to be. But the market for buying properties that are occupied by tenants right now, very, very difficult.
So turning to commercial sector, so there's a question about renegotiation of leases for percentage base lease, with the idea that, you know, a landlord might reduce the base lease to stay afloat and all that. Have you been seeing that? What kind of negotiations have been happening along those lines?
Yes. We've actually been telling and advising our clients to enter into those agreements with some, I mean, you want to make sure you have some provisions in there and some precautions we probably don't have to get into today, but that's actually advisable. It's better to do that, renegotiate the terms of a lease, than to let rent go by. You know, better to renegotiate terms than to you know, have a tenant that doesn't operate on terms because you didn't make the communication. So we are seeing that, to answer your question. I think we're going to see more of that before this pandemic is over. But I think that's advisable as long as you have the right terms in place.
So there another question really about how this links with affordable housing issues, and particularly in places like San Francisco that have rent control. So some people are concerned that it's an opportunity in a way for people to try to get tenants out now during the crisis so that they can go back to market rate, you know, reset to market rate at the end of the crisis, and that there hasn't been sufficient attentiveness or protection for those folks. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there are still, I'd say there's still protections in place. I mean, the fact of the matter is it's very hard to evict a tenant right now during the whole COVID-19 pandemic. Even after the pandemic, if the landlord was going to seek rent, it would probably be for, particularly in San Francisco, rent that was owed after the pandemic or before the pandemic. So I don't think it's necessarily going to be easy for landlords to get over that hurdle, even if they're thinking, oh, I can get a tenant out just to, you know, up the rent. I think it's going to be, they're still going to suffer, or I guess face a number of burdens and challenges and red tape in order to do that. The San Francisco rent ordinance is voluminous and, you know, there's so many protections in there. I just find it very difficult to think that a landlord who's been looking for their opportunity could use this. And Dean Preston's legislation kind of hones in even on something like that. So,
yeah. One version of that I could imagine is for tenants who really don't know their rights, that right now there's nothing that prevents a landlord from actually serving a notice, a 3-day notice, and then serving a complaint for an eviction, even if a court might not hear it. And that might scare a lot of folks to actually leave before anything is even resolved. So I could see that as a way that, you know, there may be some risks to tenants, particularly in rent control jurisdictions.
That is a possibility. Absolutely. You know, so there is a possibility of that. I'd also say, you know, the current moratorium in place allows 60 days for a tenant to respond to an unlawful detainer action, as opposed to, I believe it was 30 prior to that, or 5. But yeah, so I mean, the time frame has been extended. Hopefully the 60 days gives tenants, you know, extra time to kind of, you know, figure, you know, learn their rights, hire counsel. There's so many options out there. The Eviction Defense Center and you know, lots of legally affordable options out there. So hopefully, I think the goal should be that tenants know their rights, period. You know, so hopefully that will alleviate that burden a little bit. And we'll see if Dean Preston or someone else in San Francisco enacts another measure to safeguard that.
There's another question about whether or not some people, particularly companies or individuals with large amounts of money, can take advantage of this situation and this opportunity, like what did happen after the foreclosure crisis, a lot of people, made a lot of money off of that. And I have heard, to the degree that some landlords maybe are stuck in a situation where they can't continue because they need the cash flow, they might be forced to sell and sell at a lower price than they would normally expect. And that there could be kind of more accumulation of rentals and properties, which has already been happening to some degree by single large corporations, and sort of more concentration of ownership of housing. What do you think about that?
Well, there are, that's always a possibility. We saw that in 2008 for sure, in 2009 and 2010. I definitely think there's a situation where that could evolve here, particularly probably at the end of this year, as we see how the pandemic progresses. But when the dust has settled, I think, and when the protections are no longer in place, the moratoriums and Governor Newsom's order, I think it's very likely, actually, you'll probably see some people taking advantage out there. There's always corporations, there's always individuals who are looking for opportunities like this to buy up properties and to scale up, so to speak. Not saying that's right or wrong, but it happens in situations like this. And it's unfortunate. You're probably going to have some landlords, like you just said, Professor, that can't afford to pay a mortgage after a while, whether it's the tenants not being able to pay and the landlord not being able to get the proper assistance. They'll be forced to sell at a lower distressed price, so to speak, and somebody's going to be able to reap the benefits from that. And I actually, unfortunately, I see that happening probably throughout the state. And I don't think San Francisco is going to be an exception here, not this time around. Particularly if we see another wave of this pandemic. Fingers crossed we don't.
Right, you're right. Because even if somebody has sufficient resources to sort of survive for a little while, not everybody's going to have sufficient resources to survive for a long while. Exactly.
I actually give a lot of credit to the landlords and even small businesses who have survived throughout this pandemic since March to June. Whether they're reopening now or have just functioned, it's very difficult out there. So, if you have the resources, thank God you made it this far, but hopefully you don't have to make it another 3 to 6 months, So.
And I think that goes both for landlords and for tenants, because, what I read was nationally, there was a surprising percentage of tenants who paid their rent in May and I guess in June, but now there's a fear that they're going to run out of money. And so there's going to be quite a bit more defaults in the future. So there's another question about commercial leases. So a person asks, any projections for triple net leases? For example, do you see a trend in corporations like Safeway or CVS using their clout to do things like getting out of paying rent and their leases and subletting, et cetera?
Absolutely. They have a lot of clout right now. And perhaps to renegotiate lease terms first and foremost. If you're a big business like Safeway, there's a Safeway actually in Emeryville, not too far from me. I could see them, renegotiating the terms of that building's lease even, because there's a large portion of that building that's not even being used. So you're in the driver's seat, I would say, if you are a big business like that in a big commercial space like that, because, if you vacate or if you try to opt out of the terms, what's the landlord going to do? What's the lessor going to do? Go out and advertise the space to someone else, Amazon, Walmart, or something. And not to mention, we recently had the protests, which, unfortunately, there was a lot of destruction of small businesses all around the Bay Area. So, there's been a lot of businesses that have been kind of hurting. And so I don't think it's a good time if you're a lessor to not negotiate with your lessee if they want to negotiate new terms. I think you're going to come to the table if you have common sense. But to answer the question, I think now is a great time for businesses like Safeway in any big business, so to speak, that's renting out a commercial space like that. You don't even need to be that big. It's just a good time. Even in so that's what I would say.
One person also is asking about, in terms of tenant advocacy, it's sort of in some places it's very strong, and in other places not quite as strong. Do you see a role for organizations like USF to provide kind of some help in this?
Absolutely. And, I kind of look to you, Professor, because you've been on the front lines for so long. You've done awesome things, even at the state level. So it was even great to take your landlord tenant class. But I definitely think there is a role for USF to play. The community, San Francisco, the Bay Area highly respects USF, its achievements, its stances on positions on social justice. So I think I'd actually go further than that. And I'd say USF has a responsibility and obligation, if you will, to step up and lead the charge to advocate for those rights, particularly because the institution is a pillar in the community. So I think people would look to that pillar for representation or for education. So I think to that extent, whether it's a legal clinic, whether it's services, whether it's just education, whether it's an additional class, I think USF has a real role to play in that. One of the things that I do, we have these educational workshops from time to time for landlords that are, not the most financially sound and wealthy, but there's also a place to do that for tenants. Definitely a place to do that for tenants these days in particular. Everybody needs help, regardless of what end of the socioeconomic spectrum you're on. So I think USF has a role to play, and I'd be happy to engage in whatever USF wants to do.
Great. Now you're on tape saying that. So.
Oh, what did I do?
So, kind of drawing back big time. So, when law students study landlord tenant laws, you remember, there was a big shift in the late 60s and 1970s nationwide towards favoring tenants in courts, and that led to a lot of new doctrines, the implied warranty of habitability and other kinds of things that have helped tenants. And then in each state, there's been kind of a constant fight and struggle between landlord advocates and tenant advocates overall. And so, and you've spoken about, this bill in Congress that would establish kind of a national rent control. Do you think, could this be a pivot? Could this be an inflection point where tenants overall nationally sort of get more power vis-a-vis landlords, at least in the residential context?
It could be. It very well could be. It depends on who's going to author the legislation, as you know. Depends on the players backing the legislation. CAA, California Apartment Association, has a position on this. The California Association of Realtors, the National Association of Realtors has a position on this. So it's all going to depend on a number of factors, but the answer is yes, it definitely could. Tenants have been pushing for something like this for a while, but also landlord advocates have been pushing for something like this for a while. Because, to streamline legislation like this for, especially if you're a landlord advocate in California, because there's so many laws. If you had a streamlined process of rent control, it would make it so much easier to go through the process, as opposed to going through about 5 layers of laws, which is what you do now. So I think if you're in California, it's an interesting time, because you'll probably see some tenant rights advocates say, we need national rent control, and you'll probably see some landlord advocates. Yeah, we need national rent. Did we agree?
Right.
Different ends of the spectrum, but yeah, I think you'll see some more agreement on that issue if it actually comes up, if that legislation passes. So it'll be a very interesting thing to see, interesting development.
And as always, the devil will be in the details, right?
He's always there.
I wanted to interject really quick. This is a fantastic program. I'm taking a lot of notes, but just wanted to keep an eye on time. We have 5 minutes left. So Professor Iglesias, maybe one or two more questions.
Okay, all right. So kind of moving from the huge national back to the sort of local or at least statewide. So one person asks about whether or not the Ellis Act is harder to do in this current situation. My understanding is that Ellis Act evictions are subject to the same judicial council order that restricts evictions until 90 days after the declaration of emergency is over. Is that your understanding as well?
That is my understanding as well. So there's, again, the Ellis Act is not like some exception in these times. One thing you might want to do in theory, maybe you serve an Ellis Act notice because the provisions, the termination won't take place until a year from now. That might be some strategy, but to your point, it's not like there's an exception for Ellis right now.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, why don't we close it off there then? Carolyn, do you have some things to do before we end?
I just wanted to thank you both so much for doing this program. It's really timely and important. Jonathan, thank you so much. You are making us proud.
Oh, thank
and
you.
And Professor Iglesias, thank you.
Thank you all for having me, and thank you, Professor. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Julie. Really appreciate you guys. And look forward to
And thank you for everyone who joined us today. This is being recorded, so we will email it to you later. So please feel free